In late 2003, one of Yosemite National Park's most reliable rangers and her trusted horse disappeared. During a routine patrol, the wilderness offered up no secrets and the case was eventually scaled back, leaving a father to search alone. 5 years later, a startling discovery made by geology students in an isolated ravine finally provided an answer to where her horse was, and in doing so, unlocked a far darker question about her own fate. The static that crackled from the dispatch radio at Yosemite National Park headquarters wasn't unusual for a late September evening in 2003. It was the sound of distance of granite walls and dense pine forests interfering with the signal. But the silence that followed the static was deeply wrong. Rick Sandoval, the dispatcher on duty, leaned closer to his console. He'd been running through the end-of-shift check-ins, a routine litany of call signs and acknowledgments. Every ranger had reported in their voices clear or faint depending on their location in the sprawling wilderness. Every ranger, except one. He keyed the microphone again. Dispatched to Ranger 3 David. Radio check, over. More silence. Not even the telltale click of a key mic in response. Ranger Anya Lockhart, call sign 3 David, was one of the most dependable people on the force. At 29, she had a quiet confidence that commanded respect. She was never late, never sloppy. A missed check-in was so out of character. It immediately set a low hum of anxiety through the small control room. Sandoval followed protocol, waiting 5 minutes before trying again, the clock on the wall ticking with agonizing slowness. The sun was dipping below the colossal granite domes, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. But the beauty was lost on him. As twilight began to bleed into the valley, the park transformed from a natural wonder into a labyrinth of shadows. When his second and third calls went unanswered, the hum of anxiety escalated to a sharp alarm. Anya was on patrol in a quiet northern sector of the park, a network of trails less frequented by tourists. She was on horseback, riding Orion, her steady and trusted chestnut partner for the last 4 years. A ranger and their horse are a single, highly capable unit. For both to vanish without a trace was not just improbable, it was nearly impossible. The official process began to churn. Senior rangers were notified. A preliminary search plan was hastily sketched out on a large topographic map. Anya's patrol route highlighted in yellow, but before the first search team had even gathered there, the front door of the headquarters swung open. It was David Lockhart, Anya's father, in his late 50s, with the weathered face and steady gaze of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the landscape. David was a legend in the park. He had retired from the very same ranger station just 2 years prior. He didn't need a call from dispatch to know something was wrong. He felt it in the crisp evening air and the rhythm of the park he knew as well as his own heartbeat. He didn't ask frantic questions. His voice was low and steady, but carried an undeniable urgency that cut through the procedural calm. He looked at the map, his finger tracing a path Anya knew well. He confirmed her patrol sector, her start time, her expected route. He knew the terrain, the pitfalls, the hidden dangers the maps didn't show. He was the first to say what the other rangers were only beginning to fear. This wasn't a broken radio or a simple delay. Anya was in trouble. His presence galvanized the response. The official missing person report was fast-tracked. As full darkness consumed Yosemite Valley, the first search teams deployed. Headlamps cut sharp, lonely beams through the immense blackness of the forest. Rangers on foot and horseback moved out, their calls for Anya echoing off the silent granite walls. They focused on the primary trails, the logical places to start. They checked the river banks and the edges of the meadows, but the park offered no clues. There were no tracks veering off the path, no spooked horse, no discarded piece of equipment. It was as if Ranger Anya Lockhart and her horse Orion had ridden into the wilderness and simply been erased from the earth. The search had begun, but it was a search for a ghost in a landscape that guards its secrets jealously. In the first frantic days of the search, hope was a dwindling but still palpable resource. It fueled the rangers as they pushed deeper into the back country. Their efforts raced against the clock, but the wilderness remained stubbornly silent. Then on the third day, a thread of information emerged that seemed to pull the entire chaotic investigation into a single terrifying focus. A pair of hikers visibly shaken reported a harrowing encounter. They had been on a trail in a rugged, heavily forested basin several miles east of Anya's designated patrol route when they were charged by a large, aggressive black bear. They described its behavior as predatory and unnatural, forcing them to scramble up a rock face to escape. The report was electric. It was specific, credible, and provided a chillingly plausible explanation for what might have happened to a lone ranger and her horse. This new theory reshaped the entire operation. A quiet disappearance was now potentially a violent wildlife attack. The search grid was immediately and drastically shifted. The park's wildlife biologists confirmed that while rare, such unprovoked attacks were not unheard of, especially from a bear that might be old, injured, or habituated to humans. The focus moved from Enya's intended path to the vast unforgiving terrain of the bear's territory. For weeks, this became the single-minded obsession of the search effort. Teams of trackers, some of the best in the state, were brought in. They scoured the dense manzanita thickets and steep canyons, looking for any sign. A torn piece of fabric, a discarded ranger badge, the tracks of a panicked horse. A helicopter buzzed overhead, its thermal imaging cameras scanning for any heat signature that might be a body. But the aggressive bear was never located, and the search area, a sprawling expanse of jagged rocks and impenetrable forest, yielded nothing. The lead that had burned so brightly had led them into a dead end, consuming precious time and resources, and ultimately extinguishing the last embers of hope for swift resolution. As autumn turned to winter, the official search was formally scaled back. The case of Anya Lockhart was reclassified from an active search to an open investigation, a bureaucratic term for a mystery left to fester for the National Park Service. It was a tragic but closed chapter. For David Lockhart, it was the beginning of a long, solitary vigil. He refused to let his daughter's memory be archived in a dusty file cabinet. While the official investigation went dormant, his began in earnest. David's small home, just outside the park boundaries, transformed into a private command center. The walls of his study, once covered with family photos, were now dominated by topographic maps, pinned side by side, creating a massive, sprawling chart of Yosemite's northern half. He began a methodical process born from a lifetime of experience. He pulled old survey maps from the park archives, some dating back to the turn of the 20th century, and painstakingly cross-referenced them with modern trail guides. He was looking for the spaces in between, the forgotten paths that official searches, bound by procedure and liability, would never touch. He knew Anya shared his love for the park's hidden history, and often explored these old game trails and miners' paths. It was a detail the official investigators had noted, but had been unable to act upon without a more specific starting point. For the next 5 years, David's life found a new, somber rhythm. 3 or 4 days a week, he would pack a small rucksack with water, a compass, and a notebook, and drive into the park before dawn. He walked the trails the search teams had abandoned. He bushwhacked through dense undergrowth to follow the ghost of a path he'd seen on a 70-year-old map. He documented everything with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. Rockfalls that could have forced a detour, streams that had changed course, clearings that offered shelter. He filled notebook after notebook with detailed hand-drawn maps, his archive becoming a far more intimate and detailed portrait of the wilderness than any official document. It was a punishing, lonely task, driven by a father's refusal to accept the silence. He wasn't just searching for his daughter. He was trying to think like her, to walk in her footsteps, to understand the final path she took. During this long, quiet period, investigators performed their due diligence. Closing out the initial phase of the case, they reviewed Enya's life, searching for any hint of personal trouble that could explain her disappearance. They found nothing. She was universally described as happy, dedicated, and professional. One of the items they cataloged was a digital photograph found on the hard drive of her home computer. It was the radiant image of Anya and her horse, Orion, standing in a sun-drenched meadow, the iconic granite cliffs of Yosemite rising behind them. When an investigator showed the photo to Miles Corbin, a fellow ranger and one of Enya's closest friends, he managed a sad smile. He recounted the day it was taken just 3 weeks before she vanished. They had been on patrol together when they encountered a family of tourists who were enthralled by the horses. To give them a better picture, Anya and Miles had removed the saddles and bridles. It was a rare, unguarded moment. Miles had snapped a photo of Anya with her own camera, capturing her easy smile and the clear affection she had for Orion. For the investigators, it was just another piece of background, a poignant but irrelevant detail. For David, To whom they gave a copy, the image was a constant, painful reminder of everything he had lost, a perfect moment frozen in time, just before the world went silent. For 5 years, the case of Anya Lockhart existed only in whispers, in the quiet grief of her father and in the cold, inactive files at the Yosemite Ranger Station. The wilderness had swallowed her whole and time had hardened the silence around her memory. Then, in the bright, hopeful spring of 2008, a team of university scientists, entirely unaware of the tragedy that haunted these woods, stumbled into the heart of the mystery. Dr. Lena Petrova, a geomorphologist with a passion for soil dynamics, was leading a small team of graduate students on a research project funded by a state grant. Their objective was mundane, academic, and completely detached from human drama: to study the rates of sediment deposition and erosion in Yosemite's lesser-known ravine systems. They were mapping the unseen, charting the slow, imperceptible movement of the earth itself. Their primary tool was a ground-penetrating radar unit, a cumbersome device that looked like a futuristic lawn mower, which they laboriously hauled into remote corners of the park. For weeks, their days had been a routine of setting up survey grids, dragging the GPR unit in precise lines and analyzing the ghostly layered images that appeared on their laptop screen. The ravine they were working in that day was particularly difficult to access. There were no marked trails leading to it. They had to navigate using GPS and topo maps, scrambling down a steep, scree-covered slope, their progress hampered by thorny brush and loose rock. It was the kind of place you had to have a specific reason to visit. No casual hiker would ever find it. This isolation was precisely why Dr. Petrova had chosen it. It was a pristine, undisturbed environment, perfect for gathering clean data. As one of her students, a young man named Ben, was making a pass over a relatively flat section at the bottom of the ravine, he paused. "Hey, Dr. Petrova, you should see this." Lena walked over, peering at the laptop screen. Amidst the expected horizontal lines representing layers of silt and clay, there was a large, dense, and distinctly unnatural shape. It was a dark, oblong mass, located about 4 feet below the surface. It wasn't layered like sediment, and it didn't have the sharp, irregular signature of a buried boulder. It was a coherent, solid anomaly. "What do you make of it?" Ben asked. Lena zoomed in on the data. "The density is high, but the shape is too uniform for a random cluster of rocks. It could be a highly compacted clay lens, maybe from an ancient landslide." Her scientific curiosity was piqued. An unusual geological formation could be the most interesting data point of their entire trip. To confirm their findings, they would need a core sample, or better yet, a small excavation pit to see the stratigraphy with their own eyes. The next day, after securing the necessary permit for a minor soil disturbance from the Park Service, the team returned to the ravine with shovels and geological picks. They carefully marked out a small square directly over the anomaly. The digging was slow and methodical. The first feet were loose topsoil and humus. Then they hit a denser layer of compacted sandy loam. The work was arduous, the silence of the ravine broken only by the scrape of their shovels and their own heavy breathing. It was Ben who felt it first. His shovel struck something that wasn't soil or rock. It made a dull, hollow thunk. He dropped to his knees and began clearing the dirt away with his hands. What emerged from the soil was not the gray of stone or the dark brown of clay. It was a curved, off-white shape. He brushed away more dirt, revealing a series of parallel, slender bones. "Lena," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's a rib cage." A stunned silence fell over the small group. The academic excitement of a geological discovery evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. This was no longer a research site. This was a grave. They abandoned their large shovels for smaller hand travels, working with the delicate care of archaeologists. Over the next hour, they slowly, painstakingly uncovered their discovery. It was the complete, fully articulated skeleton of a large animal, lying on its side as if it had been gently laid to rest. The bones were bleached, but perfectly preserved in the cool, stable soil. As they cleared the dirt from around the legs, they found something else. To rusty, U-shaped pieces of iron positioned right where the front hooves would have been, horseshoes. Dr. Petrova stood back, her mind racing. An entire horse, buried 4 feet deep in a ravine, miles from any official trail. This was no accident of nature. An animal that died on the surface would be scattered by scavengers in weeks. An animal caught in a rock slide would have crushed bones and be mixed with tons of debris. This horse had been deliberately and carefully buried. She knew immediately what she had to do. She pulled out her satellite phone, a device she carried for emergencies, and placed a call to the Yosemite National Park Dispatch. The response was swift and serious. Within 2 hours, the senior rangers had arrived at the scene. They took one look at the carefully excavated pit and the perfectly laid out skeleton, and their faces hardened. They recognized the profound wrongness of the scene, just as Lena had. They sealed off the ravine with yellow tape, declaring it a potential crime scene. The discovery sent a shockwave through the park's long-serving staff. The memory of Anya Lockhart and her missing horse, Orion, was a deep scar, a story told to new recruits as a cautionary tale. A park farrier, a grizzled man who had been shoeing Yosemite's horses for 30 years, was brought to the site. He knelt by the pit, examining the rusty horseshoes the rangers had carefully bagged. Even through the corrosion, he recognized his own handiwork. He pointed to a small, barely visible notch he hammered into the outer edge of every shoe he fitted, a unique personal mark. He retrieved his records, and the confirmation was absolute and chilling. The shoe size, the wear pattern, and his private mark all matched. The skeleton and the ravine belonged to Orion. The 5-year-old cold case of Ranger Anya Lockhart was instantly violently reopened. The discovery answered one question, but posed a dozen more terrifying ones. They had found her horse, but where was she? The careful burial ruled out the long-accepted bear attack theory and pointed squarely at human intervention. But why bury the horse, not the rider? Was she still out there? The grim discovery in the quiet ravine had not provided closure. It had only deepened the chasm of the unknown. The FBI was notified, and a new lead investigator was assigned, a sharp, tenacious cold case detective named Iris Zola. Her first order of business was to treat the entire ravine as a major crime scene, bringing in a full forensic team to dismantle the grave, bone by bone, in search of a clue that had remained buried in the dark for half a decade. The discovery of Orion's remains transformed the case from a cold file into a live, high-priority investigation. A temporary command post was established in a conference room at the Yosemite headquarters, the space quickly filling with whiteboards, fresh maps, and the low hum of determined activity. The atmosphere was charged, a stark contrast to the 5 years of stagnant silence. At the center of this new storm was Detective Iris Zola, a woman whose reputation preceded her. She had been brought in from the state's cold case unit for her sharp analytical mind and her intolerance for assumptions. She moved with a clipped efficiency, her gaze missing nothing. Her first official meeting was with David Lockhart. She had read the file on him, a summary of a grieving father's desperate, lonely search. She expected to meet a man worn down by years of unanswered questions. Instead, the man who walked into the command post was anything but broken. David Lockhart was quiet, his face a mask of stoic grief, but his eyes held an unwavering fire. He carried a heavy cylindrical canvas bag over his shoulder. Without a word, he walked to the largest empty table in the room and unrolled its contents. It wasn't one map, but dozens of them taped together with archival tape to form a massive, intricate tapestry of the park's northern wilderness. It was a staggering piece of work. Official park trails were marked in black ink, but they were outnumbered by a web of fine-colored lines David had drawn in himself. Red lines for forgotten miners' tracks from the 1800s. Blue for seasonal creek beds that became passable in the dry months. Green for game trails used by deer and bear. The map was covered in tiny meticulous annotations written in a precise, steady hand. Rock slide here, false arrow for overhang cave, potential shelter. Spring appears here, late Aug. It was a living document, a 5-year diary of grief, hope, and relentless exploration. Detective Zola and the other investigators in the room fell silent, staring at the map. It was a more detailed, more intimate, and more practical guide to the search area than anything the Park Service possessed. David pointed to a spot on the map with a steady finger. "This is the ravine where you found him," he said, his voice low and raspy. Then he traced a faint green line running along the ridge directly above it. "This is an old game trail. It's not on any of your maps. It's the fastest way to cross this ridge if you're on foot and know the land." Anya knew it. We walked it together when she was a teenager. He was providing them with what the original search had so desperately lacked, a focused, logical starting point. The original theory of a bear attack had pulled resources miles away to a place Anya likely never was. David's map suggested a completely different narrative, one centered on the hidden pathways known only to the most experienced woodsman. Detective Zola looked from the father's exhaustive work to the official map on the wall. The contrast was profound. The official search had been looking at a map of a park. David Lockhart had created a map of a life. His private obsession had just become the investigation's most critical asset, while new search teams were being organized to meticulously comb the area pinpointed by David. Another quieter investigation was unfolding. Under the sterile white canvas of a forensic tent erected near the ravine, a team led by Dr. Alistair Finch, a veteran forensic anthropologist, was conducting a painstaking examination of Orion's skeleton. The bones had been carefully cleaned and were now laid out on a vast blue tarp in perfect anatomical order. Dr. Finch worked slowly, bone by bone, his eyes scanning every surface through a large magnifying lamp. The initial findings were deeply perplexing. There were no signs of predation, no teeth marks from a bear or mountain lion. He found no cut marks that would suggest a human had butchered the animal. Most significantly, he found no massive catastrophic fractures consistent with a long fall into the ravine. The skeleton was almost entirely intact. This horse had not been attacked by wildlife, nor had it tumbled to its death. The evidence was pointing more and more strongly to a deliberate act, but the cause of death remained a complete mystery. Frustration was beginning to set in when Dr. Finch focused on the lower bones of the right foreleg. He noted a minor hairline fracture on the cannon bone, an injury that could have happened post-mortem from the shifting of the earth. But he examined it anyway. He ran his gloved finger along the tiny crack, then paused. He leaned closer, adjusting the angle of his lamp. Deep within the fissure, something glinted. It was an unnatural shimmer, a speck of metallic light no bigger than a grain of sand. It wasn't a mineral deposit from the soil. It was something foreign, something that had been driven into the bone with force. Holding his breath, he picked up a pair of impossibly fine-tipped tweezers. The entire tent seemed to hold a collective breath as he carefully probed the crack. After a tense minute, he managed to extract the fragment. He placed it in a sterile Petri dish. Under the magnifier, it was revealed to be a tiny, sharp-edged shard of dark gray metal. It was clearly not lead from a bullet. It was too hard, too brittle. Later that day, back at the command post, Detective Zola stared at the minuscule fragment sealed in a small evidence bag. "So it's not a bullet," she stated, more to herself than to Dr. Finch. "Definitely not," he confirmed. "The composition is wrong. The shape is wrong. It's a fragment, a chip off something larger. It was driven into the bone with significant force, likely at the moment this fracture was created. Whatever hit this horse was made of a very hard, very specific type of metal. The discovery was a monumental breakthrough for 5 years. The case had been devoid of any physical evidence of foul play. Now they had this, a tiny, baffling piece of metal that proved Orion had been struck. It was the first concrete clue that suggested Anya Lockhart hadn't just vanished. She had likely walked into a violent confrontation, but the clue was also a puzzle. The fragment was too small for easy identification. Zola knew it would have to be sent to a highly specialized materials science laboratory, one with the equipment to analyze its elemental composition. As she sealed the fragment into a larger evidence container for transport, the weight of the situation settled in. The father's maps had given them away. This tiny shard of metal had finally given them an act of violence. Now the entire focus of the investigation would shift to finding the who and the why. The answer, she suspected, was locked somewhere in the elemental makeup of that single enigmatic speck of metal. While the mysterious metal fragment was making its slow journey through the bureaucratic channels of forensic science, Detective Zola refused to let the investigation stall. An answer from the materials lab could take months, as she was determined to use that time to build a new foundation for the case. The discovery of Orion's violent death and deliberate burial had rendered the original 2003 investigation files almost obsolete. Every interview, every statement, every minor detail had to be re-examined through this new, darker lens. Zola's team began the painstaking process of starting over. They began by re-interviewing everyone in Anya's life, her colleagues, her friends, her distant relatives. The conversations were somber and repetitive. Everyone described the same person, a dedicated, kind, and profoundly capable woman who loved her job and had no known enemies. She didn't have a troubled romantic life, no financial problems, no secret addictions. The narrative was so consistently positive that it was almost unhelpful. There were no obvious cracks in the facade of her life that could explain a violent end. The breakthrough, when it came, was subtle. It wasn't a bombshell revelation, but a minor detail, an echo of a past frustration that now sounded like a premonition. The team was conducting a second interview with Miles Corbin, Enya's close friend and fellow ranger. They sat in the same ranger station break room where he and Anya had shared countless cups of coffee. He spoke about her passion for the park, not just the grand landscapes, but the small, delicate ecosystems that often went unnoticed. She was a real purist, Miles recalled. Stirring his coffee, she hated seeing the park disrespected, litter, people going off trail. It all got under her skin. But there was one thing that really truly angered her. He paused, looking out the window towards the granite peaks. The poachers. Zola leaned forward slightly. You mean wildlife poachers? No, not just that. Miles clarified. Artifact poachers. Guys who come in with metal detectors and shovels, digging for old bottles, belt buckles, stuff from the gold rush camps. She called them grave robbers of history. She felt they were stealing the park's soul piece by piece. He explained that while tourists saw Yosemite as a natural wonder, it was also a historical site, dotted with the remnants of 19th century mining camps and settlements. These areas were federally protected, and disturbing them was a serious offense. In the months before she went missing, Miles continued, his voice lowering. She was more fired up about it than ever. She said she was finding more and more dig sites on her patrols, especially in the more remote northern sectors. Someone was running a systematic operation, and it drove her crazy. This detail, which in 2003 had sounded like a simple workplace grievance, now landed with the force of a physical blow. A violent confrontation, a buried horse, an illegal digging operation in a remote area. For the first time, a plausible motive began to take shape, one that had nothing to do with Anya personally, but everything to do with her uniform. She wasn't a random victim. She was a symbol of authority who had stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see. Acting on this new electrifying thread, Detective Zola dispatched junior detectives to the park's records archive. Their task was tedious but specific: to pull every single patrol log, incident report, and citation issued by Ranger Anya Lockhart for the 12 months leading up to her disappearance. In September 2003, they spent days sifting through stacks of paper, the dry official reports painting a picture of Enya's daily life, warnings for improper food storage, tickets for illegal camping, reports on trail conditions. Then they found it, a name, Kieran Briggs. He appeared twice. The first citation was from May 2003 for using a metal detector in a restricted historical zone. The location noted in Enya's neat handwriting was within the same network of ravines where Orion's body had been found. The second citation from July 2003 was more serious. A legal excavation. Anya had caught him with a small shovel and a bucket, having dug a 3-foot hole near the foundation of a long-vanished miner's cabin. According to her report, Briggs had been belligerent and argumentative, claiming he was just a history enthusiast. Anya had confiscated his shovel and issued a hefty fine. The name immediately sent the detectives scrambling for the original 2003 case file. Kieran Briggs had indeed been on the initial list of people to interview. A note from a deputy who had spoken to him back then was brief. Briggs claimed he was at a dental appointment in Fresno on the day Anya disappeared. A cursory check at the time had seemed to confirm it, but Zola, reading the old notes, felt a surge of adrenaline. With the new context, a weak alibi that was once good enough to dismiss a minor person of interest now looked like a potential crack in a carefully constructed lie. The investigation now had a name to go with its motive. Kieran Briggs, a local resident from a nearby town, was described in public records as a part-time handyman and amateur historian. He ran a small, cluttered antique shop that specialized in gold rush-era memorabilia. Zola's team began a quiet, discreet background check on him. They learned he was a solitary figure, respected by some for his historical knowledge, but regarded by others as an obsessive crank. He had no significant criminal record, just a string of minor citations related to his activities in the park. As the team built their profile of Briggs, the possibility that Anya could still be alive, however faint, loomed over the investigation. The discovery of the horse without its rider created a deeply unsettling ambiguity. If she had been the victim, of a panicked crime. It was possible she hadn't been killed, but taken. This sliver of hope, however remote, added a desperate urgency to their work. They weren't just solving a 5-year-old murder. They were potentially racing against time to find a survivor. Every detail about Kieran Briggs, his habits, his properties, his known associates, was scrutinized with the intensity of a search for a living person. The quiet hobbyist who collected rusty artifacts had just become the investigation's prime and only suspect. The winter of 2008 bled into the new year, and the investigation settled into a tense, frustrating limbo. Detective Zola and her team had a suspect, a motive, and a location, but the evidence remained stubbornly circumstantial. Kieran Briggs continued his quiet life, operating his antique shop, seemingly oblivious to the net that was slowly being woven around him. He was placed under discreet surveillance, but his movements were unremarkable. He went to the grocery store, the post office, and his workshop. He was a man hiding in plain sight, protected by a 5-year gap in time and a lack of direct proof. The entire case now hinged on the analysis of a metallic speck smaller than a pinhead. The call that changed everything came on a gray Tuesday morning in February 2009. Zola was at her desk in the command post, staring at the constellation of evidence pinned to the whiteboard. Anya's photo, a map of the ravine, Briggs' mugshot, a picture of the excavated skeleton. The phone rang, and the caller ID showed a number from the state's Department of Justice Forensics Lab. The voice on the other end belonged to a materials scientist, a man whose excitement crackled through the phone line. "Detective Zola, we have the results on your fragment. This is fascinating." He explained that they had used a scanning electron microscope with an energy dispersive ray spectrometer, a device that could identify the elemental makeup of the tiniest sample. "It's not steel, not iron, not lead," the scientist said. "It's a tungsten carbide alloy, a very specific one." Zola felt a jolt of electricity. "What does that mean in plain English?" "It means it's from the tip of a geological rock hammer," the scientist explained. "This particular alloy is incredibly hard, but also brittle. It's designed to chip away at hard rock like granite without dulling. When it strikes something with enough force, especially something with the tensile properties of bone, it doesn't bend, it microfractures. A tiny piece can shear right off." He went on to say that this specific alloy was favored in a handful of high-end brands, used by serious geologists, prospectors, and rock hounds. It was not a tool you'd find in a typical home toolbox. It was a specialist instrument. After hanging up, Zola stood and walked to the whiteboard. She picked up a dry erase marker. Next to Kieran Briggs' photo, she wrote in large block letters, "Rock Hammer." All the disparate pieces on the board suddenly snapped into a single horrifying image. Anya confronted Briggs in the ravine. Briggs, the amateur prospector, holding the tool of his trade. A moment of panic, a violent swing. The lab result was the linchpin. It was the direct physical link between the victim's horse and the suspect's illegal hobby. It transformed the theory of a confrontation over artifact poaching into a near certainty. Zola now had enough to convince a judge that her circumstantial case was worthy of a search warrant. She spent the rest of the day meticulously preparing the affidavit, laying out the chain of logic. Step by undeniable step, Anya's documented frustration with artifact poachers. Her specific citations issued to Kieran Briggs in the very area of the crime, the discovery of the buried horse proving a violent cover-up, and now the forensic link to a specialized tool used for the exact activity Briggs was engaged in. A judge signed the warrant before the end of the day. The raid was executed at dawn the next morning. A convoy of unmarked cars rolled into the quiet residential street where Briggs lived. While one team entered his small, unassuming house, Zola led a second team to a detached garage that served as his workshop. The air inside was thick with the smell of old metal, wood polish, and damp earth. It was a hoarder's paradise of history. Shelves overflowed with dusty bottles, rusted tools, and carefully labeled boxes of pottery shards, tools of every description. Hung from pegboards, the search was methodical and tense. They were looking for one specific item, a rock hammer, possibly with a damaged tip. They scoured the workshop, sifting through the chaotic clutter. Every hammer, pick, and chisel was examined and bagged. But after 2 hours, they hadn't found it. A cold knot of doubt began to form in Zola's stomach. Had he gotten rid of it years ago? Was it at the bottom of a lake, just as the initial search of the workshop was winding down? a specialist from the National Park Service's Historical Preservation Office, who had accompanied the team, called Zola over to a set of flat file drawers. "Detective, you need to see this." He had opened a drawer to reveal dozens of artifacts, each nestled in its own foam cutout and meticulously labeled. He pointed to a collection of square-headed iron nails. "These are from the 1850s. They were only used in the structures at the old Pinyon Creek logging camp." He then pointed to a shard of blue and white ceramic. "And this is a specific pattern of English earthenware. We have found other pieces, but only at one site." Zola felt her pulse quicken. "Where is that site?" The historian looked up at her, his expression grim. "It's a small, historically significant miner settlement from 1852. Its location is deep, inside the same ravine system where you found the horse." It was the checkmate moment. They hadn't found the murder weapon, but they had found something just as damning. Briggs hadn't just been dabbling. He had been systematically looting a protected archaeological site, the very site Anya was likely patrolling when she disappeared. His collection was a detailed catalog of his crimes, proving he had been there, proving he was lying, and providing an ironclad motive for silencing a federal officer who had caught him in the act. They might not have found the hammer, but they had found his entire reason for using it. The circumstantial case was now overwhelming. Zola picked up her radio. "We have enough," she said. "Bring him in." Kieran Briggs was brought to the command post, not to his local police station. Detective Zola wanted him on her turf, in a room where the walls were covered with the ghost of Anya Lockhart. He walked in, with an air of aggrieved indignation, a man bothered by a bureaucratic mistake. He was of average height and build, with pale, watchful eyes that darted around the room, taking in the maps and photos before settling on Zola. He maintained his composure as she began the interview, recounting the same flimsy alibi he had given. 5 years earlier, "I told the other officer in 2003, he said, his voice a reedy monotone. "I was in Fresno that day. I had a root canal. You can check." "We did check, Kieran," Zola replied calmly, her voice even. "We checked back then. And we checked again. You had an appointment. That's true, but you canceled it that morning. The dental office records are very clear, so I'll ask you again. Where were you on September 23, 2003? A flicker of panic appeared in Briggs' eyes, a brief disruption in his carefully maintained calm. The foundation of his 5-year-old lie had just crumbled. He stammered, trying to backpedal, suggesting a mix-up in dates, but the certainty in Zola's voice was absolute. She let the silence hang in the air for a moment, before she slid a series of photographs across the table. They were high-resolution images of the artifacts from his workshop, the square nails, the ceramic shards. "These were found in your workshop this morning, Kieran," she said. "Our expert from the Park Service has identified them. They come from a single protected historical site, a site deep in the ravine where we found Anya's horse." Briggs stared at the photos, his face paling. The evidence of his secret obsession was laid out before him, irrefutable proof of his illegal activities. He looked trapped. Zola pushed the final piece across the table. It was a magnified image of the tiny tungsten carbide fragment pulled from Orion's bone. "And then there's this," she said softly. "Our lab found it embedded in the horse's leg bone. It's a chip from the tip of a geological rock hammer, the kind a man who digs for artifacts might carry." The fight went out of him. It was as if a string had been cut, and the puppet-like facade of the harmless hobbyist collapsed. His shoulders slumped. His face, which had been a mask of defiance, crumpled into a portrait of pathetic self-pity. He stared at the table for a long time, the silence in the room broken only by the hum of a computer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he began, the confession tumbling out, a torrent of words held back for half a decade. He explained that he was in the ravine that day, digging at his secret spot. He had just unearthed a rare intact bottle when he heard the sound of a horse. He looked up to see Anya Lockhart on Orion, standing on the ridge above him, looking down. He said she didn't shout. She just dismounted and made her way down into the ravine. Her expression won a grim disappointment. "She knew who I was," Briggs recounted, his voice trembling. "She recognized me from the last time. She told me I was done, that this time she was taking me in. She said I was under arrest for a federal felony." The words, felony, arrest, sent a wave of pure panic through him. He saw his entire world imploding, his precious collection, The work of years would be confiscated. He would go to prison. He said he begged her, pleaded with her to just take the bottle and let him go. But Anya was resolute. She reached for her radio. I lost it, Briggs whispered. My hammer was in my hand. I didn't even think. I just swung. He described the sickening thud as the hammer struck her head. She collapsed without a sound. The horse, Orion, became frantic, rearing and pulling at its reins. In his frenzy, terrified the noise would attract attention, Briggs lunged at the animal, swinging the hammer wildly to silence it. The second part of his confession was even more chilling, delivered with a detached, methodical coldness that belied his earlier panic. The violence was over, and a different part of his mind took control, the meticulous, obsessive planner. He knew he had to make them disappear. The horse was a dead weight, impossible to move far. He spent hours digging the pit deeper with his confiscated shovel, eventually rolling the massive animal in and burying it. He worked all through the afternoon and into the night, guided by the moonlight. But Anya was different. He was determined that she would never, ever be found. He couldn't bury her there. The risk of a future discovery was too great. He spoke of a place he knew, a place he had found years earlier while exploring off-trail, a deep, vertical cave, a narrow fissure in a rock face. Hidden behind a curtain of dense manzanita brush and poison oak, it was a perfect hiding place, a natural tomb. He described how he carried her body, a grueling, nightmarish journey of several miles through the dark woods. He pushed her into the fissure, listening as her body tumbled into the blackness. He was certain no one would ever find her there. It was a place that didn't exist on any map, a secret kept by him and the silent pines. When he finished, a profound quiet settled over the room. The 5-year mystery was solved. There was no complex conspiracy, no shadowy organization. There was only a pathetic, obsessive man, a moment of panicked violence, and a desperate, chillingly effective cover-up. Detective Zola looked at the broken man across the table, then picked up her radio to give the order. A specialized search and rescue team was to be mobilized. Kieran Briggs was going to lead them back to the pines, back to the secret grave where Anya Lockhart had lain hidden for more than 5 years. The journey to Anya's final resting place was a somber, silent procession. Kieran Briggs, stripped of his indignant facade and now shackled, led the way, his steps shuffling and uncertain. He was flanked by 2 deputies. Behind them walked Detective Zola and David Lockhart. David had insisted on being there. After 5 years of searching the wilderness alone, he would not let his daughter be brought out of it without him. A specialized search and rescue team, experts in high-angle and confined space recovery, followed with heavy bags of ropes, harnesses, and lighting equipment. They moved through the dense forest, following a path that wasn't a path at all, pushing through thorny undergrowth and over fallen logs. The air grew cooler as they descended into a shaded, moss-covered part of the forest, a place the sun rarely touched. After nearly an hour of grueling hiking, Briggs stopped. He pointed a trembling finger toward a wall of granite, almost completely obscured by a thick, tangled curtain of manzanita and poison oak. "It's in there," he mumbled. "Behind the brush. If you didn't know it was there, you would walk past it 1,000 times and see nothing." It was not a cave in the traditional sense, but a deep, vertical fissure in the rock, no wider than a man's shoulders. It was a scar in the earth, a crack leading down into absolute blackness. The SAR team went to work with professional quietude, clearing the brush from the opening and setting up a complex system of anchors at pulleys on the sturdy pines nearby. The lead rescuer, a man named Gavin, did a final check on his harness and headlamp before giving a nod to his team. He was to be lowered into the fissure. The air that breathed out of the opening was cold and smelled of damp earth and deep time. David Lockhart stood back, his face a chiseled mask of grief, watching as the rescuer disappeared into the dark maw of the earth. The only sounds were the soft whir of the pulley system and the occasional dislodged pebble skittering down into the depths. The radio on Gavin's chest crackled to life every few minutes with a terse progress report. Descending past 20 feet, 40 feet, walls are narrow but stable. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, Gavin's voice came over the radio, calm and professional, but heavy with the weight of his discovery. "I have contact. I have visual confirmation of human remains." A collective silent breath was released. By the team above ground, Zola placed a steadying hand on David Lockhart's shoulder. He didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on the black opening in the rock as if he could see through the stone and soil. To his daughter below, the recovery was slow and incredibly delicate. Gavin worked in the cramped darkness, carefully securing Enya's remains in a specialized recovery bag. The process was one of profound respect, a rescue mission 5 years too late. Finally, the signal was given. The team above began to haul the line, bringing their fallen colleague home. As the bag was gently laid on a tarp near the opening, a heavy silence settled over the small clearing. The on-site coroner began his preliminary examination with quiet dignity. He noted the tattered remains of Enya's ranger uniform, pinned to the fabric over her chest. Tarnished but intact was her ranger badge. David closed his eyes for a long moment. Even in this dark place, she was still a ranger. Then the coroner found something else. Tucked into a small pocket of her patrol trousers was a small, weathered leather pouch, its drawstring pulled tight. It was an anomaly. Zola carefully took the pouch. It was not standard issue equipment. She looked over at Miles Corbin, who had been asked to come to help with any potential identification of personal effects. His face was pale, his eyes filled with sorrow. Zola held out the pouch. "Miles, do you recognize this?" He nodded slowly, reaching out a hesitant hand. "It was hers," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She made it herself. She was always collecting things." With trembling fingers, he loosened the drawstring and tilted the pouch. A small collection of dried seeds and thistle heads spilled into his palm. "What are they?" Zola asked gently. "Invasive species," Miles explained, a sad smile touching his lips. "This one is Italian thistle. This is yellow star thistle." Anya was on a one-woman crusade to map and remove invasive plants from the park's native meadows. She said they were choking out the wildflowers. She would collect the seeds whenever she found a new patch so she could log the location and report it for removal. The discovery hung in the air, a revelation more profound than any piece of evidence in the case. This small pouch of seeds was a testament not to how Anya died, but to how she lived. On her final day, in her final hours, she had been doing her job, not just the law enforcement part, but the deeper, more personal work of a guardian. She had been protecting her park, right down to its smallest flower, her purpose unwavering until the very last moment. Kieran Briggs was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His collection of stolen artifacts was turned over to the National Park Service archives, becoming a permanent exhibit on the importance of historical preservation. In the years that followed, David Lockhart did not let grief be his only legacy. After the case was closed, he began volunteering for the Park Service. He shared stories of the Gold Rush miners, the park's early days, and of a dedicated ranger who knew the wilderness so intimately that she noticed even the smallest, most unwelcome seeds, and who gave her life protecting the place she loved.